We have this bizarre hubristic self-preference, but when somebody tries to tell you what God likes, we call them the arrogant one. We as individual consumers of reality sit in judgment all the time, giving bad Yelp reviews to God's weather, to his landscapes, to the temperature. And then when somebody says, I think God likes this, I think God doesn't like this, they try to actually get away from themselves as the standard. All the fussers will just be like, you're so arrogant.
Met a ghost of a king on the road when I first fell. Fire burning to my knees I fell. Met a ghost of a king on the road.
And you see the Babylon Bee stole your joke?
Which one? They steal lots of my jokes.
Well, this latest joke stealing was about Kamala becoming president. You called that 3 months ago and on this very podcast.
Yep. People are working at it.
Yeah. You think they're happening right now still?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. People are actively pushing for it. People in the campaign, people in the Democratic Party. But there's obviously, I was telling somebody today, and I've told, we're already getting sucked into election conversation, but we were going to talk about other stuff. You have to think of these parties, both parties, as really large mafia families. Do not think of them as unified, singular, centralized entities. There's not a single shot caller. There are different sub-godfathers with their partisans. Mm-hmm. There's the Biden people and the Obama people and the Kamala people, and some of them overlap and a lot of them don't. And then there's the people who just want to make sure they get a win out of this no matter what. And so with $1 billion spent by the Kamala campaign, there's a whole lot of people who, rather than placing a bet on Kamala, were cashing in on the bet being placed by donors so that they win either way. People who are walking away, they lost, but they're walking away with a ton of cash, a ton of consulting cash, a ton of fees, all of this stuff. And so the really powerful people are the people who work hard to not lose ever. The people who are working hard to always have a win-win situation. So if Kamala wins, they do much better. If she loses, they still personally win. Those people exist one tier down. They're like the deep state of every organization. Mm-hmm. And they just kind of, they rise above candidates and they operate below candidates, and they just don't ever pop up.
They're sort of
too visibly.
They're the producers that make sure whether the film gets made or not. Yeah, they get a nice piece.
Yep. Yeah. And so the fact that that campaign spent $1 billion in 100 days.
That's shocking. It's unsustainable.
$1 billion flowed into pockets, into bank accounts. Into whose bank accounts? Into whose pockets? And
celebrities made very
$1 billion.
Well. Yeah.
And a lot of people cashed in on that and cashed in on it in a lot of different ways. And in ways we'll never know. We won't get all the answers. But don't go thinking that it's one unified team with an offensive coordinator and a coach and an owner and a quarterback. It's like, nope, it's not a tiered hierarchy like that. Not even kind of. It's way more like mob families.
So you're saying, in answer to the question, are they trying to do that? Well, which they are we talking about? Obviously someone is, because they still have 60 days of cashing out on.
Yeah. There is not a singular personality who's shot calling, and they don't happen to be a they, them.
Right.
Like they is a reference to like the Allies in World War II. They. There's a lot. And the same thing's true on the right. This is normal. Any large alliance has different shot callers and factions that are unified.
Right.
So one of the little post-election things I saw that was funniest was from the animated Hobbit, actually, which was the Battle of Five Armies. And it was labeled different armies were different parties, then Gandalf was Trump. Like, stop. We are all going to fight on the same side. It was pretty funny.
Should we spoil our big news right now?
Yeah, that's a great transition. Our lamp pick is the animated Hobbit. It's a throwback. This is
1977 Rankin-Bass animated Hobbit.
Yep, the 1977 one. We're picking this for two reasons. One, nostalgic awesomeness.
Some of those songs will get in your bones.
Yep, nostalgic awesomeness for your kids if they haven't already seen it. They ought to have already seen it, but they haven't. You need to let them see this. And two, because it's going to be on the Canon Plus app. Yep. So we'll have the movie, the animated Hobbit from 1977, will be on Canon Plus. It does not need filters.
You can just roll it out.
Being a 1977 homespun cartoon with musical numbers, but it's very, very fun, and it's worth having the conversation about Tolkien, about the Hobbit, about filmmaking in general, about the conviction and
all the other Hobbits that have been made since.
Yep. And the conviction and compelling nature of a story told that is human and interesting, and as opposed to
there'll be questions. There's sections of the internet that hate parts of this cartoon.
Yeah.
There's some weird stuff in it, and then some amazing stuff.
Yeah. So that's our pick because it's worth talking about.
It's
very
also
worth talking about, and it's very worth watching with your family. So having if you haven't seen it, check it out and make sure your kids have all checked it out and find out what they think. Then I would transition here to something I hate a lot, and I think that it's evil.
Wow. Okay.
But not in like a towering way. It's just
this is petty evil.
Yeah, it's pesty. It's just a pesty, unhelpful way of viewing films, which comes down to I didn't like that. I didn't like that. Okay, so like, ought you to have liked it? Like put an ought in there. Like, should I not like it? Like when people say I didn't like it, like you got to do better than that.
So don't let your children get away with it.
No,
saying that I didn't like it.
It has to be why I didn't like it. Here's the reasons why I didn't like it, and they need to be not as subjective as I didn't like it. You can't drift down to other things you don't like and just base the whole pyramid on things you do.
A throne of lies.
Yeah, things you do or do not like. So I did not like that because I hate lies. I did not like that because I hate it when films try to be manipulative or deceptive or they trivialize darkness. I didn't like that because what? Ultimately, our goal is always, and we've talked about this over and over and over again, but stories are soul food. They're what we feed on, and we are shaped by and catechized by, and all of our instincts are formed by them in life, in our own narratives. And it's really, really basic is, are your affections becoming more like God's or are they not? They are not in a neutral place.
I mean, I think most people that just sound so ambitious and almost hubristic to say that I did not like this because God doesn't. You want to be in a place where you can say, I don't think God likes this. And I am trying to model my affections on his. And I don't think he likes this. Why don't you think he likes this? Why do you think he would throw this in the trash bin? You have to be trying to mold yourself to it's not some cocky, I'm the voice of God. You are instead saying...
It can get there. And what I mean by that is not in a bad way, but it can get there when you're in a group and a bunch of people are playing dumb and they're going limp on the floor as hard as they can, trying to be relativists. But they're trying to be relativists without being relativists. What they're saying is, yes, there is an objective standard of truth, goodness, and beauty. There is an objective standard of beauty, and it is God. You just have no access to him.
Right.
So
you
instead
don't know
of
what he would think about films,
and so they try to deny the epistemic basis for making an aesthetic judgment based on the affections of God. And ultimately that's problematic. If you try to create this infinite gulf between the creature and the creator so that the creature can never really know the creator's affections and the creator's desires and the creator's tastes, then you are drifting into Islam, where there's this unbreachable gulf between the creator and the creature. But for Christians, the incarnation happened. The Holy Spirit is real. You are possessed by God. You've been remade by God. You're bearing his image, and you should love God, and you should be trying to get to know God better and better and better. And the more you do, the easier it is for you to know his taste.
Yeah, true, noble, good report. Those are qualitative terms, I should say.
But you get to know what God loves by actually listening to him when he says what he loves in Scripture, and then looking at the natural world and finding those things that he loves. So as I've made The Riot and the Dance as I produce that, as I've worked on narration, it's so clear, like over and over and over again, what God is like. Like just the kind of, and of course, one part of what he's like. He's infinite.
Yeah,
so it's not like you're going to get a handle on him. He's not simple and predictable. But the humor, like the bittersweet and the humorous, the tenderness, everything he does, all of the things that he does that are just crazy trick shots, like the crazy trick shots in the natural world, and his affection for his creatures that he brags about in Scripture, and listening to the ravens cry out to him all day, and feeding the lion, and then all these things, and bragging about what an idiot the ostrich is in Scripture.
Yeah.
That it's a kindness of God that the ostrich is an idiot. Her idiocy is part of his kindness, which is a really weird thing to learn. So the ostrich is dumb. And he says, that's me being nice to her because she lays her eggs on the ground, and otherwise she'd be stressed out and worried all the time. She'd be worried about her eggs, she'd be worried about her young, and instead I just made her really stupid. So she is laying her eggs on the ground, and she's not afraid, and she's not worried, and she just runs around carefree because she's dumb. And I did that because I'm nice.
Right.
And him taking pleasure in a really foolish animal, and the foolishness of an animal is remarkable. But all this to say, just get to know him.
Yeah. Or when God says, my voice makes the deer give birth. I think sometimes we think that's like something so terrifying, the animals are like having babies, but it doesn't seem like that's the most accurate description. It has to be something more like, no, God's telling the deer it's time. They're all out there, and he's aware it's spring again.
So how did God clothe the flowers of the field that are going to be burned to ash tomorrow? Like the love,
better than Solomon.
Love and the care he takes in beautifying trash, the love and the care he takes in beautifying something you're going to mow, you're going to throw in the compost heap.
Yeah.
Or as I talk about in Tilt-A-Whirl, every single individual snowflake is a master work.
Right.
And in one snowstorm in one city, there's kabillions of them, each individually a master work.
Yeah.
And he throws a kabillion of these like artistic masterpieces on your front walk, and we complain about it. And he sends a dog to pee on them. Mm-hmm. Like it's like has so little care for it. He doesn't overvalue every little masterpiece. Mm-hmm. That he's just of the abundance, the overwhelming abundance of his gift. So my point is consciously attempt to get to know him through his art. Get to look at his art, get to know him via his art, and then look at human art. And once you've really gotten to know this divine, infinite artist, and as much as you can, as much as we're capable of knowing, as we're going to be perpetually knowing him better for the rest of eternity, but as you get to know him more, it becomes easier and easier and easier to look at pieces of human art and be like, I'm just.
Well, it reminds me,
really self-important, and I can tell that God hates that. He hates self-importance.
This masterpiece is way overvalued by the artist.
Yeah, just when people are preening and overwrought and really believe themselves to be true lofty masters, and you look at the actual true lofty master, and you look at how playful and incredibly hospitable and gracious he is with this ridiculous abundance he throws at us.
Yeah. Okay, so that reminds me, we're working on the Joel Salatin documentary.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a clip from that in which Joel is talking about all the different kinds of grass in his field. And he's just nerding out over grass that nobody quite knows the name of. And the point of the grass is not that Joel's obsessed with grass, but instead it's to be chewed, digested in the four stomachs of a cow, pooped out, worked through by chickens, grubs and everything. But watching Joel appreciate God's work in grass is kind of what you're talking about. That's what do.
So what he's doing as a little farmer is he's trying to get to know God the gardener, God the creator, and he's trying to image that in his own relationship to his land and to his animals, which is fantastic. It's a great mindset to have. But he's also viewing himself as a recipient of this land, like a servant receiving talents, and his job is to give the land back to God better. He's not supposed to use it up. He's supposed to return it multiplied. And so he is really, really thrilled that he can tell God here at the end of his life that he's increased the topsoil, he's increased the water retention, he's increased the per acre yield. He has way more earthworms. He's like, so he's giving God more earthworms. Like, look, you gave me this patch of dirt.
It was a scoreboard we didn't even know was up there. Number of earthworms.
So he's sitting on this patch of dirt, and he's very excited to give God a return on his investment. God's investment having been placing Joel on this dirt, placing this dirt in Joel's possession. And then he's returning to God a multiplier of earthworms and a multiplier of beef per acre and grasses.
An extremely soft pig meat.
Yeah, wonderful pig meat. Yeah. And I've never watched anything that, because I've watched a screener already early. I've never watched anything that made me want to raise pigs, but this one did. Dude. But all this to say is, when Christians try to assume the position that you can't know what God likes or does not like, and they try to make it a humility attack where they attack an individual person and they say, who are you to say what God likes or does not like? How could you possibly know? What they're saying is, underneath that, is that it's not knowable, that God is not knowable. And that's just a fundamental heresy, a very fundamental heresy that God is not knowable, not reachable by us.
That is Allah.
Yeah.
He doesn't care about art because he's separate from us.
There's a gulf you're never going to reach.
All Islam cares about is the art breaking a rule, part of the
submission.
moral code.
Yeah, it's all about, it's just raw submission. But for us, if you read the scriptures and you calibrate yourself to God's affections and you read history using those calibrations that you've gained from scripture, and you read history, you can learn a lot about God reading his big historical epics. And then you can read the stories of the aphids and the ladybugs and marsupials, the echidna, probably my favorite animal that we have filmed anywhere. Although even as I say that, a bunch of other animals come flooding into my head. And I'm very excited.
The echidna is your favorite?
Okay. Of things we've filmed. But as I say that, I immediately think about being underwater, kicking sharks, and all the other stuff we've done. There's so many amazing, amazing, amazing things. Nile crocodiles that are living deep, inland in the continent of Africa, but they're still Nile crocodiles that are exhausted because they haven't eaten in a year.
Yeah.
They're waiting for the migrations. And if they don't eat once a year, they're done. But they're eating annually is absurd. Like, that's crazy. These just reptilian monsters.
What a story of patience and also the ability to control your metabolism.
Patience and idiocy.
Right. Yeah.
You could move to more populated areas. You don't have to be in the Serengeti here. Yeah. You could, although when I say that, Serengeti does have a lot of animals that cross a lot of rivers at least once a year. So maybe other places don't. But
seems to be working well.
Yeah, there at least some of
the
them.
crocs. Yeah.
But the point is, if you watch The Hobbit in this case, or anything, there's a certain amount of Christian latitude when you're eating a Dorito, and you don't have to freeze yourself and try to access, divine judgment every single second. Just like you don't have to thank God for every single heartbeat.
Yeah.
So God gives you every heartbeat, and it's actually a life or death gift. So if he doesn't give you the next one, you're in trouble. And so once again, it's like I could sit here, and I've joked about this in talks with school kids and other stuff, and I could sit here and feel my pulse and just say, thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. And I could just thank God for all the heartbeats, but then I've wasted all of them. Mm-hmm. Why did he give me these heartbeats? I need to go utilize them. I need to go. I can thank him for them collectively, and I'm now going to go utilize them. We don't need to be paralyzed constantly trying to figure out whether God likes this Dorito better or that Dorito better. Okay. Obviously, he likes the intact Dorito better.
Right. Well, I thought you were about to say Cool Ranch was better than original cheese.
Inside a bag. Let's say you open a bag of Doritos and you're trying to sort which ones are actually aesthetically superior. A, it's not that hard. B, don't waste your time.
Right.
Like, we don't need to be doing that all the time. As you become more and more like God, your instincts and your reflexes, you should be able to make your own judgments in a way that accurately images him. So when people say they don't like a movie, and then they're like, it just wasn't for me. It just wasn't my taste. It's like, is that a good thing? or is that a bad thing? It could be either.
The self-report is not the epitome of wisdom, and I think
Right.
a lot of our current education has led to the self-report as the ideal, unassailable position. You're like, oh, I thought this was good, as opposed to did you do a good job?
And there's a lot of mistakes that are made this way. They're made by housewives about animals in the animal kingdom. They're made by.
Here comes the spider exhortation.
Yeah, but it's just true. Made by housewives, made by kids. All the time, people pass judgment. Whenever I've had somebody complain to me about the weather, I always say, "Oh, you should tell God. Give him your comment card immediately."
Yeah,
I am displeased. I didn't want as many lakes to fall out of the sky today. I would have preferred that some other day. It's like. Yeah, and we have this bizarre hubristic self-preference. But when somebody tries to tell you what God likes, we call them the arrogant one. So we, as individual consumers of reality, sit in judgment all the time, giving bad Yelp reviews to God's weather, to His landscapes, to the temperature. You will not find a temperature people can't complain about. Animals in the animal kingdom that will just fuss all the time.
Yeah.
Fuss all the time. And then when somebody says, I think God likes this, I think God doesn't like this, they try to actually get away from themselves as the standard. All the fussers will just be like, you're so arrogant. Who are you to say?
And you just gave an awesome extended version of how to respond to college kids in your classmate. I feel like that's in your classroom. That's one that we've seen regularly. With kids, I find they often need to be handed a vocabulary to critique with. So they'll say, that was weird, Dad.
Yeah.
And then the follow-up response for them is always to offer them, what did you find a new taste? Because actually that's how kids handle food as well.
Yeah.
If it's a food they've never tasted before, they're going
to this is not to say that Children of Men is a great film, so show it to your 4-year-old. It's not, it's not to do that. It is to say you want to help yourselves and your kids get away from their own personal emotional responses being treated as authoritative. They are not authoritative. They are real.
So how do you help your kids do that? How do you help them develop a vocabulary? Obviously, we've been talking about how to tell the stories and appreciate what God's already done for you. When you're actually on the couch watching the movie and it finishes and you think, whoa, we just finished, Spirited Away. And the kid, you're like, well, some of that was pretty weird, kids.
It was great.
But great weird.
It was great, children. Be shaped and molded by it. Become more and more like it.
Right.
It's honestly, with my kids, I can, this is not like a universal prescription, but I can say that with my kids, there's a lot of nature documentary. There's a lot of just playful, fun stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of conversation that I've talked to parents where they're overly stressed about getting all the answers right when they converse with their kids about, I was just telling somebody this over the weekend. They were saying there's so many lies. There's so many lies and so many things that I can't get them all. And I really do believe that the most important thing is getting your kids into an active stance and not a passive stance of recipient. They're not just receiving.
So say you show your kids Home Alone for Christmas.
Right.
You don't need to point out every time Kevin is a brat to his family.
Yeah, but you should talk about it.
Yeah.
So you should talk about it, but there shouldn't be some other thing where it's like, oh, I honestly am glad that Butch's Dirty Magazine is going over their heads. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about that. Then you're like, oh, am I being deceptive? It's like, no, you don't actually have to. You don't have to catch everything unless it's something that is in fact dangerous to them right now at their current frame. But training them into an active stance, training them to watch and enjoy a thing as a judge, judges, and not sitting there with a mirror watching their own reaction and gauging the quality of the thing based on their own emotional response. That is just a dangerous place to go. And so you end up like in so many pointless tar baby fights with people when they are appealing to their taste and you're trying to weirdly, because you didn't see it, but this is normally what Christians do, subordinate your own arguments to that person as the judge. And you keep trying to convince them and make them respond differently on an emotional level, instead of just being very simple, saying, well, you ought to have liked it.
Okay, so that's pretty. We should unpack that a little bit more. You're saying, let's. What movie should we pick here? Pick something like The Hobbit. The end.
You know what? I'll do. Yeah,
The Hobbit. Pick a different.
Let's say I Am Legend.
Sure. Okay. So you're saying if someone says I didn't like I Am Legend, you immediately try to show them the things you liked about I Am Legend. The really fast zombies. Yeah. Oh, you don't. So
I don't.
So they're saying I like
what I mean is that when people say I didn't like that, what we're tempted to do is fight with that emotional reaction and try to steer it or influence it to emote in a different direction because it processes it differently or whatever. But what we never do is we never dethrone that emotion. We actually sit below it and we petition it. And we're trying to get them to, as the ultimate authority, emote differently, as opposed to getting them to acknowledge they're not the ultimate authority and they ought to be subordinating their emotional reactions to a higher standard.
Yeah.
So when somebody says, I can't handle scary movies, I just can't. I'm like, great. Don't watch that. It's like, that's,
sure.
Don't do it.
You don't feel the need to petition.
No, if I'm talking to somebody and I am saying you should really try some Lagavulin, you should really try some Ardbeg, and if they say I can't handle whiskey, like it messes me up. Done. Great.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
They know their frame. I'm like, oh, great. Like,
yeah.
I'm not gonna try to push you to drink whiskey when you actually get lightheaded or whatever. Like, no, I don't need to do that. If you're terrified, and I'll make qualifications here in a moment. But if you're like, I do not have the frame to handle that kind of storytelling,
the I Am Legend here, right?
Yeah, like okay,
that's fine. But then,
great. But when you're like, I hate animation, ooh, grow up.
Gotcha.
It's
different responses. Yeah,
it's different. When somebody acknowledges that their frame is weak, they are weaker and they can't handle something. Okay, like that's a different kind of reaction. Like I can't handle that. And there's things that I have chosen to show or not show in nature documentaries for that reason. Because like we've talked about before here, the knowledge of good and evil is a dangerous thing.
Can really be sad for little people.
Well, anybody. Yeah. But just because it happened doesn't mean that it's healthy for you to know about. And that goes for good and evil. It doesn't mean that it's supposed to be on screen in your mind. You got to be aware of your own frame. It's when people pass emotional judgments or false judgments. Somebody told me recently, I can't stand I Am Legend because it's just so hopeless. And my response was incorrect. It's actually not hopeless at all.
Doesn't he make it to...
It's an argument. The whole thing is an argument about providence and hope. And the good guys win.
Yeah.
Like in that debate over man, what happens when man tries to be God? It goes to hell. But in that situation, on the other side, there's still providence and grace. There's still God.
Survivors.
There is still God who is still weaving a story through even that dark obliteration that man has caused. And the film is fundamentally hopeful. It is fundamentally hopeful. That's the argumentation that wins. So when somebody says, I hated it because it was so hopeless, it's like, wrong, actually. That's just factually incorrect. What they're probably getting at is I didn't like the way it made me feel.
Right.
And that needs to be unpacked. Were you feeling the way you ought to be feeling?
Yeah.
Or were you not? Were your feelings correct or incorrect? And if they're incorrect, is it a limitation of your frame? Is it because you're weak?
Did you feel bad about the dog because you had a dog?
Is it because you're weak? In which case, fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. But when somebody says, I hate the Hobbit movie, for example, because I hate animation, or I hate old animation. I hate corny. I hate anything corny.
Yeah.
They need to get over themselves. And that's like God made roly-polies.
Yeah.
You know, there's all sorts of cornball, ridiculous stuff happening.
Watching my beagle scratch his ears. Pretty corny.
Yeah. And so the movie is fantastic in that it's not self-important. It's not self-aggrandizing. It's just fun. It's fun, and it's trying to tell this story in a way that is fun,
and
even if it's very lo-fi.
Straight up the middle as like what the story is. They're not going to try
crazy adaptation
to underplay anything. They're going to try to deliver exactly what they thought Tolkien wanted.
And it's subordinated to the book, which is still worth reading, and you'll get so much more. But it also does some things. Should they have taken another
crack on the elves? Maybe.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not. Possibly.
Blonde Orlando Bloom is, I don't think, I mean,
yeah.
There's a case to be made that the cartoon
so
elves are
our lamp pick is The Old Hobbit. It'll be on Canon Plus. I'm excited to talk about it and engage with other types of storytelling, other approaches to epics, because this is a very childish fairy tale approach to a story that's been treated as a massive, grandiose epic. Mm-hmm. And the childish fairy tale approach is really fun and reveals some things in the story that you won't get if you try to go to the self-important
I think your kids
epics.
are going to pick up on it better than they would ever out of like PJ's bloated trilogy if you dared to show that to them.
If you dared to sit through it.
Right. I think I watched the first one of those, but I haven't.
Yeah. I watched none of the first ones of those.
Well, we'll have to play some clips for our
I might actually have to watch a little more of it.
We'll get a producer in here to play some clips.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. But overall, if you think, we'll talk about this in a future one too, but when people are artistic, like when they're artists, writers, whatever, they tend to want to chase the thing that makes them feel, chase the passion, right?
Yeah.
The downside of that, it's very dangerous. But one of the biggest downsides of that is training yourself not to chase your passion, which is dangerous unto itself, but to quit everything that is not your passion. So the positive, which is still dangerous, is just chasing positively something that makes you passionate. But this is why artists ruin every single relationship with everybody who loves them. This is why they blow everything up, because at some point, they're not going to feel passionate about that. And they've trained themselves to simply abandon and walk away from anything that is not igniting that passion. Consumers are kind of watered down versions of that. And so rather than trying to be shaped by the personality of God, by natural revelation, by scripture, by a biblical reading of history and so on, rather than trying to be shaped and molded and changed and to become more like God, they're still just feeding themselves whatever ignites their pleasure center. So my pleasure center goes, and I'm igniting it or I'm not.
So you're saying they have a lot of times we consumers have the same flaw.
Yes.
Where we're just chasing what we like.
Normal consumers are just like the artist class, just watered down. We're
and
doing
here
this.
I thought
we're
it was
doing
fundamentally different.
We just do the same. We do the same thing.
Yeah.
So
okay.
What ignites my pleasure center, but we don't think about is how to mature and mold and change that pleasure center, how to actually refine your taste, how to grow as a human, how to actually grow into a healthier place such that folly is actually distasteful to you. Like it actually is something that you're not fond of. So becoming more and more like God means having a particular stance, like towards your own pleasure in consuming books and film and music, that you're not the God of that system. Your taste is not infallible, and you need to go submit it to God and try to make it more like God. Then bring it, when accountable to that, bring it into this system and try to utilize it as a more refined, more mature muscle. But that also requires you to have an active stance towards the media you consume and not a passive recipient stance. Like I've said before, don't be a baby bird. You don't just want to like ingest whatever Hollywood is dropping down your throat. You want to actually always have your mind on and actually engaging with and processing what's playing in front of you rather than just having it happen to you. So I think I said at some point in here, make sure you happen to the movie. The movie doesn't happen to you. Makes you a lot less enjoyable to have at parties. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, it's great. So that's kind of a long. I mean, like we went a lot of different directions, but it's the Hobbit as a lamp pick is great because it will enable a lot more of this conversation. But become an active consumer, like be an active consumer. Train your kids to be active consumers, and having that paradigm adopted, and pairing that with believing that your taste centers and your pleasure centers need to actually be in submission to God's tastes and God's personality, and you need to be becoming more like him. Those two things will equip you to handle whatever Hollywood throws at you, even if you don't pass some of the tests.
Sure.
So even if you watch things and you miss stuff and it sails by you, that's not that big a deal.
Right. Say you missed Nate's take on Shrek. Right?
Did anybody? I don't know.
No, they haven't admitted yet.
Okay.
Because it's only releasing today, actually. So
and we're recording too early. That's great.
Right.
Means everyone agreed with me.
Yeah.
So
the feedback
far
is overwhelmingly positive. Yeah.
So everyone agrees with me because nobody's listened to it yet. Those two things. So I would encourage parents, don't worry about having to get 100%, about catching 100%. About understanding every little drop of worldview that comes through in a film.
Yeah.
That's not as important as a mode of operation, the activity of your children in terms of how they are actively engaged with what they watch, and them not treating their own emotional reaction as if it's authoritative. Like those two things are very, very important.
Yeah.
And that includes getting them a vocabulary to do it and other things like that.
There's maybe we'll just keep running down this line, but it's so exciting when you watch a kid pick up on something that you hadn't picked up on.
Oh yeah.
Or when they pick up on totally the angle of the movie that's the bad part. And they say, well, I don't really think that's right. And so chasing that sort of feeling, even if, there's that fussy scene or the occasional bad word, as you said, that you leave in sometimes because it increases the kid's resistance. Yeah.
Yeah. And even then, just knowing that you're weak, you could be weakening them by releasing them into the wild at some point, and they're just going to have the socks blown off them just walking down the street.
Right.
They're not going to be able to, handle this world at all.
Well, the conversation I was going to jump into today was actually going to be a little bit more on sci-fi, which I Am Legend was a sci-fi story. I can't remember if it was Heinlein or someone else, but
what is sci-fi, Brian?
And I was actually going to read something that I think you will hate. The definition of sci-fi from Heinlein himself, the dean of science fiction, as they call him.
Perfect.
He says sci-fi is realistic speculation about possible future events based on adequate knowledge of the real world and thorough understanding of nature and the significance of the scientific method.
I would throw most of the back half of that away.
Yeah. So just the idea, he thinks it's based on what you understand of this world's workings, hyperbolized into the future. Or not hyperbolized, but thrown forward into the future.
That's dumb.
Why is that dumb, Nate?
Could you never tell sci-fi about the past?
Well, I mean...
Or the present?
It definitely seems like that limits it to a very specific kind of sci-fi. And even that doesn't really get at what makes sci-fi tick.
Yeah.
Like, it's not really that you understood scientific rules and therefore you imagined a great story in the future. It feels like sci-fi is much more playing with that. I mean, it seems like if you had to pick a genre that was talking about utopia or dystopia, it's mostly sci-fi. Like, sci-fi is obsessed with the idea of what makes society good or bad, based especially with technological flavors thrown on top.
Yeah. Sci-fi... Well, there's things that famous science fiction examples have been utilized for, which is big discussions over good and evil, and purpose in life or nihilism. So good and evil, or total empty, brutal nihilism, or divine providence, and so on.
Right.
That kind of things happen, but ultimately, science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy. And it's a subgenre of fantasy. It utilizes technology and something that is created by the author to have some semblance of reality, like a faux reality. So instead of like asking people to
buy that there's
disassociate and buy the rules of a completely different world,
sure,
you're trying to operate inside the rules of this world. And so you're trying to operate inside the rules of this world, but you're throwing a wrinkle, some kind of madness into the system and creating a fantastical fairy tale inside the structure of this going, mad. So instead of here's a magical school and here's a wand and here are the rules, there's Death Eaters and there's whatever we call the other guys because they never got a name. But we have Death Eaters and we have
Dumbledorians,
normies, normie magical, where J.K. Rowling is creating all these extra rules, right? Creating the extra rules of the world. Science fiction begins normally in this world, and so is a form of magical realism, which is also a subcategory.
Nice.
Inside of fantasy. So magical realism where you are here, and then this thing goes wrong here, and it is believable. There's one what if. There's one what if jump to get to that, and then we're going to tell you this story. Now, there's other situations where they're beginning in a completely different future or a completely different past.
Right.
And there's a whole string of what ifs.
Yeah.
And so science fiction is very far-flung science fiction. So just like fantasy, where there's low fantasy, like domestic fantasy, high fantasy,
liminal fantasy.
Yeah,
right.
Alternative world fantasy, parallel world fantasy. There's a lot there. And it also has magical realism in a fantastical setting. Science fiction ultimately utilizes tech. And that's kind of the difference.
Yeah.
It
but you're
utilizes
saying it's
tech.
doing the same thing. The thing you chase with sci-fi is that same sort of fantasy, that explosion that's exciting and
it's still a what if.
throws a
There's still a
wrench.
what if jump. There's always a what if jump, and there's sometimes many, to get you there.
Right.
And the more primal it is, the more human and primal it is, the more effective it is. The more dependent on gadgets it is, the worse it is.
Right.
So, is Star Wars sci-fi or is it fantasy?
Yeah.
Sci-fi fantasy.
Right.
It's like, why? Well, because we have lasers. We have tech. It's like we have some tech. We're playing with fantastical tech.
Yeah.
And so there's that science fiction infusion, but we also have
in space.
We also have the Force.
Right.
And we have, all this more mystical stuff. And so it is sci-fi fantasy.
So you see, obviously they're all classed under speculative along with some other things. Do you think speculative is kind of the root? Spec fiction is sort of the root there, or do you think they're all adaptations of fantasy? Or I guess that is the what if is what defines speculative, right? Even when you put horror in there, or one of the other genres of spec fiction.
So what I would say is that here's my ultimate inversion. All forms of speculative fantasy, science fiction and otherwise, are actually forms of realism. The only fantasy that we tell is that category that we call realism. That's it. The only category where only category where stories exist that are in no way like the real world, aren't like the real world at all.
Oh, it's straightforward.
Is
realistic.
that category that we call straightforward realism, just realism.
Yeah.
That realism is
gotcha.
fantastical. It's all fantasy. If by fantasy you mean make-believe, fake world, like everything that we call realism belongs over there. If you come over to speculative and you have crazy what ifs, you've got fantasy, you've got tech, you've got the occult, you've got monsters. So you've got horror and you've got epic and you've got, like places where tech and horror merge and places where tech and the epic merge. All that's like the real world.
Gotcha.
That is what the real world's like.
Ayn Rand.
Everything.
Ayn Rand. I knew this were going to come
absolutely
around.
Crap.
It's coming over to the only non-realistic stuff.
Anybody who's just updike, like anybody who's over there, like this is the real. This is the real. I will only write the real.
Yeah, materialism. Straight up materialism.
Like no, that's
it's
so unrealistic.
And it's the most boring fantasy.
The most boring, the most depressing, just empty. So when people try to write grounded stories, and people will talk about that. I'm trying to write grounded stories, smaller stories. I'm trying to write.
Does that mean stuff that you don't have to work too hard to imagine? Like you could, is that what it's talking about?
Yes, and also cheaper to produce in film. But
I understand that one. But
so a grounded story is a story about regular happenings.
Okay.
So a thing that occurred in the regular happenings of the day to day. That's not realism. That's just a grounded story. It's smaller. So you're telling a smaller story here. But even there, you're not talking about it. But even there, these people who are walking around in your story, they're walking around on the outside of a ball of mostly lava that is hurtling around a star at whatever, Mach 86. And so my characters in my grounded story are balanced precariously on the outside of a ball of lava hurtling around a star through space. But I'm not talking about that.
So they do their best to ignore every heartbeat.
Exactly.
Every heartbeat must be ignored.
Yes.
In order
all
to
the magic, all the wonder has to be ignored because we're just telling a story about the mailman and the baker lady who fell in love. We're just doing that. So we're not doing the rest. We're not doing the miraculous. We're not doing
stakes the lowest.
yeah, except we're down here. So when they say grounded, that's what we're doing something grounded. They mean realism, but they actually know that it's trickier than that. So it's just down here. We're staying down here. We're not flying off anywhere. We're going to stay pretty grounded in the day to day. It's like, okay, it's smaller, but
Gotcha.
Sci-fi is just one type of fantasy. And if you just said, here's a fantasy story involving tech, okay,
Right.
there's a little bit of tech. It's now sci-fi fantasy.
So how come the sci-fi authors I know would get extremely mad that you said that?
Remember that whole thing I was talking about with self-importance and preening and aggrandizing? That's why.
Okay. Because they're thinking they're scientists.
They think they're super fancy.
Right.
They think what they're doing is very important.
They don't like that a teen writing fantasy is doing the same. High fantasy is doing the same thing that they're doing.
A big part of, and this is a whole different thing we probably shouldn't get into, but I'm just going to open this can anyway. A huge part of that has to do with our idiotic desire to guard the ontology of categories. So,
well, see, I was aware that I was tiptoeing around my love of categories as we ventured into this question. And I like, of course, that in typical Nate style, you rejected all the categories.
So if you have art, like art, conservatives and anybody fancy, what they like to say when somebody shows up with a really bad work of art, they like to say, that's not even art. They love to scold and exclude. And what they should do is say, that's crappy. And it's a much easier position to take than saying, that's not art, though. It's like, you know what? That's illustration, they say to NC Wyeth.
Yeah.
That's like, really, guys? like anybody who becomes really, really elitist and fancy and snotty and starts thinking a lot of themselves, they are more intent on exclusion from an ontological category than they are engagement with the quality of the work.
Okay.
And then because NC Wyeth is really good, they can't criticize the quality of the work, and so they attack the ontology, the ontological status of the work as non-art. It's illustration, and they create that distinction. They'll also do that with propaganda. That's not art, that's propaganda. They'll do that with they do it with low art too. They really pop off about folk art, and there's different trends where it's really welcoming and other times when they really chuck it. So grandma's basket weaving is not art. Grandpa's amazing rocking chair that he carved from a single tree stump or whatever, not art. It's like they are always fighting about the category, and conservatives can make that mistake and slip into that as well. Defending the ontological category of art is not important.
Okay.
That's not real art. It's not a win.
Gotcha.
That's really crappy. That's unhealthy. That's dangerous. That's actually a strategic win. If you go after some art and say that's foul, that's demented, that's perverse, but you don't even take the bait to fight about whether it is or is not art. So to use a real example, some artist, I think he was Danish. I think I talk about this in Tilt-A-Whirl, maybe. Poops in a can, seals the can and sells it, calls it art. Super easy to say, that's not art.
And then you get down this giant
and you go down the stupid rabbit trail.
Not? Yeah, where he said, yes, it is. It means this.
And if you win, so what? What it is insane. Like, you've lost your mind. and stop there. You don't need to defend this border that is actually not sacred. We don't need to get like sucked into that fight. It's a distraction. And the same thing happens with fantasy, and the same thing happens with science fiction.
So is that because I think what happens is we've lost a culture war, and we're trying to desperately fight a culture war that we've already lost. So by saying that's not art, you're trying to defend and preserve an academy that's already granted the art status.
So let's talk about an example. Let's say we have some book sitting in front of us, and it's like a Dune or something, and we've read it, and we're sitting here thinking about how to engage with it, and it's bad, and so we decide to say, that's not science fiction. So...
right.
But if we were to say, this is an unhealthy and demented book, we've gained some ground. That's a worthwhile conversation.
Sure.
This is or is not fantasy. This is or is not.
No matter where it gets shelved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. What matters is it true, good, and beautiful? Is it worthy? Is it worthy of my time? Is it worthy of other people's time? Will it affect them positively or negatively? Those conversations are worthwhile. But what subgenre it belongs to is a moot point and just a distraction. But whenever people start to fancy themselves the priesthood of something and they get really important, they start feeling themselves to be very important, they start wanting to police this club that they're in. They want it to be the secret society. They want it to be this very, very important thing, and people don't understand it, and you're not doing it right, is gratifying. They get all sorts of lovely chemicals in their brain from doing that. But ultimately, they're finding ways to idolize themselves and their craft and the importance of their craft. And it comes all the way back around to the way I think that creators, directors, musicians, writers, painters should all think of themselves as cooks. And they should all think of themselves as baking cookies for people or trying to make whole meals. And I don't care if you're handing out a little bit of bread and cool, clean water to millions of people. You're trying to just give them something true, good, and beautiful, something sustaining, something edifying. But it's going to just get consumed and it's going to go away. And afterwards, if nobody thinks you're important, but you did a good job, that should be wonderful. If that starts to rub you wrong, that nobody thought you were important, nobody celebrated you, nobody gave you a great, starred review, you're in it for the wrong reasons.
Gotcha.
So make a great cookie, hand out great cookies.
Right.
Be thrilled whenever you see a happy face consuming one of your cookies. Enjoy that, but don't be in it for your own importance.
Sure. So you're basically giving the ostrich call out to all of us. It's like people who are creating, like, enjoy being the ostrich.
Yeah. Sure.
You're slightly better. You're better.
It is funny though, because I've seen this. I've been invited to like participate in different times over the last decade or so in like groups of best-selling authors and people who get really upset about policing the definition of best-selling. I've been invited to participate in things that were middle grade, children's, and then I've seen YA people wanting to fight and like police the edges of YA, and middle grade want to fight and police the edges and define it really carefully. None of those things matter. They just really don't. There's good books on the other side of that line that is YA, and there's bad books, lots of bad books. There's good books on this side and there's bad books on this side. And we should be worried about that, about the aesthetic value of the things, as opposed to, is it or is it not a subgenre? And that part just is kind of irrelevant. So anyway, it's not that I hate all categories. It's just that most of them are false and useless.
The literary categories are a giant distraction.
Often, yeah, very much so.
That's a good spot to stop.
Watch The Hobbit. Find out.
I mean, we got the Return of the King on there too.
Rankin-Bass, but that one's worse. But let your kids watch it and have fun with it.
Yeah.
Watch The Hobbit with your kids, and especially the young kids. Make them unpack their affections. If they loved it, why? If they were drawn into it, why? If they didn't like it, they wanted to leave the room. They didn't like the animation, didn't like the songs, didn't like the story, whatever. Why? Unpack it.
Yeah.
And even if they get the answers wrong,
right?
Just thinking in terms of their affections and their likes and dislikes actually being falsifiable like they're, accountable to a higher standard. Even just thinking that way and then being active and engaging with something is a big win and a big step forward.
Yeah, and again, it does seem like kids go with, like I said earlier, it's weird when they don't know what to say, or it's boring when they don't know what to say, and those are ones you can't just don't let those slide.
Yeah, you can't let it go.
It needs to be.
So
no, it wasn't.
What that means is you were bored, and the question is, ought you to have been?
Right. Do you not like trolls?
Should you have been bored?
Yeah.
Or should you not have been bored? And so on. So, and if you watch I Am Legend and you're sensitive, watch it in the daytime.
Sure. Or you can even read the story, which is like a take on vampires.
Which I have not read the story, so I should say that.
Much inferior to the movie.
Okay. I've not read the story. Watch the film. And if you watch the film and you say, but where is the hope and how is this an argument about providence? There's something to unpack there. So we can do that. That's like a lamp sub pick for grown-ups.
Subcategories, not okay. Sub lamps. Yes,
yeah, sub lamp would be, we might talk more about I Am Legend if people send in questions.
That's great.
And we won't if nobody does. So if you don't want it to happen, don't send any questions.
Don't.
Little kids, The Hobbit, parents and some older kids, maybe you watch I Am Legend. I don't know.
Yeah, perfect.
In the daytime.
There's some good jump seats.
Oh, yeah.
Some real nice ones.
This has been SASF.
The world is charged with the grandeur of God, sang the poet. Have you noticed? The smile of a wife, a very good whiskey, the Sawtooth Mountain Range, football in October, first steps, meatballs and spaghetti, a really big tree. Get the things of earth today.